It's an honor to be with Professor Amy Wax, the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Professor Wax is highly decorated, voluminously published, and a veteran of arguments before the United States Supreme Court. She's also become an important figure in today's debates over freedom of speech, campus culture, and sort of the changing mores of campuses, but also of our society, at large. Let me read to you, Professor Wax, a quote from someone who worked at FIRE, and this was included in a recent sort of capsule of your circumstances, and that said that your case, and we'll get into what it is, quote, right up on the line of freedom of speech. Why are you on the line, sort of, and what is on the line in your case?
Well, I don't think I'm on the line. I mean, I admire FIRE, and they've been very helpful to me, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to take issue with that statement. The line is not defined. It's this arbitrary, sort of unseen borderland that the universities refuse to define precisely, and that's exactly, that's by design. They want to be able to punish you, discipline you, censor you for saying things they don't like or that they decide somehow are unacceptable for vague reasons, once again, that they cannot articulate. And the ultimate goal is to get rid of people or silence people or punish people who don't toe the line on a certain social justice, far-left progressive ideology. That ideology has come to be embodied in this so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities that many universities, most as far as I can tell, have adopted. The brass, the people who run the place, and they've set up these massive bureaucracies to enforce this ideology. It happens to be an ideology, as I understand it, that I have severe disagreement with. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's good for the university. I don't think that should be the set of values or priorities or their mission or whatever they want to call it. I have reasons for saying that. And I also believe that universities need to have room for people like me to explain the opposition, and above all, to explain to students that there is another point of view. Because our students today, the students I encounter, both undergraduates and law students, they have been given a one-sided, incredibly lopsided education, lopsided in many ways, but one of the ways in which it is stunted and inadequate is that they have effectively been trained not to make arguments that might lead to crime think or the wrong conclusion on the hot button issues.
Great. We'll get to that. I just want to set up the current state of play. You filed a grievance against the university. The university has sort of moved against you. What is the current circumstances of your relationship to Penn and to the law school?
Well, my own dean, Dean Ted Ruger, filed formal charges against me many months ago now, maybe 7 or 8, and asked the faculty senate to hold a hearing on whether I had committed a behavioral violation or misconduct, which is completely disingenuous because there's no evidence that I have engaged in any misconduct, and all they're really objecting to is my speech. In order to have the hearing, they have to give me a final list of my supposed infractions, which they have not done yet, and a list of witnesses who will appear. So I don't really know what the final set of charges will look like, and there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, as Shakespeare says. They have to, if it's not on tape or in writing that I've said something, just some student, now lawyer, because all the allegations are incredibly stale, a person saying I said something, they need to bring that person as a witness to testify to it directly. That is the fundamental rule of fairness. So we'll wait and see who actually testifies. And some of the allegations are just absurd. I mean, one reported by the New York Times, I was amazed that they reported something so weak, which is very revealing of how flimsy their whole case against me is, that years and years ago, some minority student thought that I talked about a case involving a Negro witness with contempt, an old case. Well, I have a very serious look on my face when I teach a lot of the times. If he misconstrued that as contempt, this is one person, that's enough of a violation to bring charges. It's totally subjective. It's a ridiculous allegation. So those are the sorts of things that are in there. All the rest is just my extramural statements and podcasts and writing, which I am fully and totally entitled to make by every tradition and standard in academia. So,
let me ask you. I was reading the correspondence, the university to you, and this word harm kept coming up, right. What do you make of that? How do you answer that allegation, both sort of practically but also intellectually, and sort of how do you push back?
Well, what they've done, and this is a major transformation, right, and not just Penn, is they've elevated this notion of harm to a weapon. They've weaponized it. They've taken the upset or the offense that people may sometimes feel when others express thoughts that are distasteful to them or that they disagree with, and they have labeled them harm. And then they have transmogrified that harm into something that warrants discipline or ejection of a person who inflicts the harm. And that is a very clever trick because it ties into this harm principle. You can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm other people. Well, that's very Millian. It ties into a kind of therapeutic psychologizing that is going on in our society more broadly, that certain statements or certain influences can inflict emotional and psychological harm, and it doesn't matter whether that's rational or irrational, whether it's justified or not. It doesn't matter whether this person is ridiculously fragile or quirky. If they say that they're upset, that's enough. Well, I don't need to tell you that that is a misuse of the harm principle. It's contrary to everything that's been said about free expression by our courts and our legal system. That's called a heckler's veto. Heckler's veto is not allowed. It's never mentioned by Penn. Of course, they pretend it doesn't exist, right? And it will wipe out academic free expression if taken seriously, because any statement anywhere can be claimed to harm you. I am upset every time I open the New York Times. It's a rag. Do I have the right to discipline the people who publish the New York Times because they harm me? You can see the absurdity of that. So it's an abuse.
And one line struck me where, the dean writes of the harm she caused is real, right? This need to kind of almost tautological, right?
I say so. I reify it by my statement, right? I just sort of ram that through.
Yeah, and what do you make of this another sort of the charge of discriminatory animus? This is another sort of language that's used, by Penn.
Well, I have no idea what that means. I mean, they never define it. This is another point I think that's important to make. They throw around these buzzwords, these labels, sexist, xenophobic, you display discriminatory animus. They never define them. They never say why they think any particular opinion of mine shows discriminatory animus. I mean, are they saying that all generalizations are forbidden? Well, that is going to not work out for them, let me tell you, because our stock in trade is to generalize about patterns that we see. They also have never committed themselves to whether the truth or substantial evidence behind my statements are still actionable as behavioral violations. You know, does it show discriminatory animus to make the statement, on average, women are less knowledgeable than men? Well, you know, every study that's been done worldwide shows that. Mona Sharon, in a column in the Bulwark that was critical of me, actually linked to a study that summarized all the data. There's never really been a study that contradicts that. It's basically true. All the evidence shows it's true. It's a distasteful thought. A lot of people are upset by it and by someone saying it. But do I get fired because I say something that is backed up by the evidence that people don't like? They need to answer that question. They need to commit on that. If the answer is yes, that's the destruction of academic freedom right there.
Let me ask you, sort of, this question of discussing groups and
Yes.
sort of, you know, why you think that's important, you know, why that's something you both in your academic work and in your sort of, let's say, public intellectual work, you seem committed to that and to that as a kind of intellectual and analytic category.
That's a very good question and a really important question, okay? And I think there is something to be said for a certain kind of restraint and decorum when talking about groups and comparing groups and making generalizations, especially in a diverse society as we have it, which, you know, has been deliberately engineered by people on the left. Until about 1985, we were, you know, like a 90% white country, so we didn't have diversity or European origin country the way we have it now. But now we have it, and we're kind of stuck with it temporarily. So yeah, you want to be prudent about it. But here's why it's important to discuss it, and we have to discuss it, Ari. Because the left has racialized and, you know, tribalized every single sector of society, every single issue. Their demands for proportional representation, for, you know, looking at disparate impacts of policies, their insistence on it is nonstop. That's all they talk about. You look at some of the programs in universities, you know, the whole DIE industry, that is their exclusive focus. And it's not enough to talk incessantly about it. They insist upon implementing policies to reify it. You have to go along with it. You have to support it, endorse it, mouth it, state it, show that you believe in it, show that you believe that groups are all equal and, you know, identical on every level as they define it.
Wouldn't response to that be, well, so then, you know, don't mimic it, right? Sort of don't, you know, why use those very same categories, right? Like, is it trying to beat the left at its own game, I guess is what it's asking.
No, it's trying to defend. And I think that actually the Republicans and the right has dropped the ball on this totally, okay? It is trying to defeat wokeism by developing a counter-narrative that their premise, that all groups are equal, right, in their skills, ability, preferences, talents, interests, everything, right, that gives them the outcomes they want, that is not true. And that is not to be expected in a free, diverse society.
I read wokeism differently. It's not that everyone is equal. It's that actually some groups deserve to be privileged over others.
Well, but,
right?
But I think the result of saying there is latent and potential equality, even if there isn't equality in fact, and we have to bring about the equality in fact. Now that results in double standards and in privileging of certain so-called disadvantaged groups. I think that's a downstream consequence. But the core of wokeness, the central pillar of wokeness is that all groups are equal, equally capable, equally, assimilated to positive norms, equally culturally equivalent in the positivity of their norms, or can easily be made so. And therefore, we would expect equal outcomes in the absence of racism. That's the piece that, of course, we need to consider. If there are unequal outcomes, it's due to nefarious forces, oppression, persecution, and racism, and we have to take steps against that. And I think a lot of people on the right are beginning to understand that that is the central ideology. Bo Weingart comes to mind, someone who runs a new website called Ideas Sleep Furiously, and he has very articulately stated that that is the ideology that has to be defeated with a counter-narrative if we are going to get rid of this stranglehold that wokeism has on our society. But, here's the thing. There are those of us who believe that that ideology is not supported by evidence, that it's mistaken, that it's destructive, that it is in derogation of freedom, of the meritocracy, of our way of life. We really stand against it, and we'd love not to have to talk about it. Really, I'd love not to have to talk about it, but the left has painted us into a corner that we either go along with what they have in mind, or we speak against it, and speaking against it can bring up ideas that are unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. And you describe yourself as a sort of a race realist.
No, I have, here's the thing. This is the tea table gossip of modern journalism. Mm-hmm. No one has ever cited a place where I describe myself as a race realist.
Well, I'm glad to be on record then that's not true.
I can't find it.
Yeah.
I can't find it.
Yeah.
They've never cited it. It's made up. Mm-hmm. Okay? They make stuff up. I know this is a family-friendly podcast. They make shit up all the time. They have no compunction about it. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's part of their project. Being honest, intellectual integrity, backing up what you say with evidence and proof, that's whiteness. So that just goes out the window. And they're actually teaching the students that. Make no mistake.
So how do you, sort through kind of, I think you have been on the record with statements that people, find shocking or troubling, and then you've had this swirl of concocted kind of, accusations or statements. Yes. How do you sort of sort through that? How do you pick out the ground kind of you want to stand on? How do you sort of find your way in that sense? And you're kind of, what accusations you fight and what you don't?
Well, I mean, that's in part determined by, what Penn ultimately accuses me of, because I'm in the middle of a formal attempt to take away my job. So that's the first priority. And I don't know how that's going to go. I mean, as one of my Washington attorneys said, Penn doesn't know what it's doing. It's never done this before.
That struck me.
They're just stumbling around.
There hasn't been a single case of first impressions. There hasn't been a single case where someone had tenure removed for speech.
Right, and that they're trying to create this new day of, we can take away your job and your tenure just for what you said and for your opinions. That is effectively, as far as I can tell, what they're trying to accomplish, and that's unprecedented. But they're kind of stumbling around trying to figure out how to best do that. Look, I know, first of all, I've been on lots of podcasts. I've published a lot of stuff, and in journals of opinion, because the law reviews are a dead zone. I can't really get published in them. If you're too politically incorrect, you're dinged. Mm-hmm. So the real action, the real exchange of ideas across the full range of what ordinary people are thinking and saying, frankly, and even people on the right are thinking and saying, it's on the internet. Mm-hmm. Right? That's where it's happening. Mm-hmm. And in podcasts and, in articles that you write. So, there I know what I've said, and I stand by what I've said. Mm-hmm. Maybe I could have said it more diplomatically or qualified it a little bit, but really there's nothing that, I would apologize for or retract. Now, what, ex-students say I said is a totally different thing. They're desperate to get those allegations because that's basically all they've got. So it's so obvious that, what I say outside of school is protected and should be irrelevant. Now, of course, they're trying to make out like it really hurts the students and upsets them that I said these things. That's some kind of harm. That's a very unorthodox thing for them to be pushing, and I think they're not sure, but they can make it happen.
I was going to ask you that sort of the boundary between, let's say, like the world and the classroom, and the way the complaint against you sort of attempts to merge those two.
Correct, they do. They're trying very hard to let my, general public or extramural statements, which, under every tradition and every statement that's been made about academic freedom are fully protected. They're trying to find ways to let that bleed into, right, my qualifications as a professor and my classroom and school conduct. And the way that they're doing it is this way. They say, well, when students hear what she said out there on, Lowry's podcast or whatever, that just makes them feel really terrible, and it makes them fear that she's going to be biased against them. And the dean has repeated that over and over. They have a rational fear that she's going to be biased against them. There's a couple of problems with that. One is he called in an outside investigator over a year ago who wrote in a report, and they've buried this, we don't find any evidence that she's biased against students. There's no evidence of bias in her grading and her treatment. Well, the other fact that never gets talked about is they have a blind grading system at Penn. That means that until my grade is finalized,
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
I don't know who I gave what grade to.
Right.
So it's only after I finalize my grades that I can look at the list and see so-and-so got A, so-and-so got B. People, because they don't clarify this, people are always asking stupid questions like, if the grading is blind, how does she know who's black and who's not? Well, they don't understand how it works, right? I don't know what race they are, ethnicity they are when I give the grade, but I find out later because I have to talk to judges and employers about how my students did. So they never talk about blind grading. They don't talk about this finding that there's no bias. They don't, frankly, I've never been biased against any student. I just deny it. I treat every student the same or, equally in that I just respond to who they are as an individual. And of course, individuals run the gamut regardless of their background. Everybody understands that. So once again, their attempt to, bleed over from outside to inside, to carry my outside statements over into implications for students, the classroom, my behavior is just completely dishonest.
It strikes me as, when you're in the world of opinion, one necessarily has to speak in generalities, right? But as a teacher, as a professor, as a teacher, one necessarily has to deal with individuals, right?
Correct.
And so there's a sort of sense of keeping that distinct, and I think you're right in your read of what Penn is doing. There's an attempt to conflate those two.
Of course, and it's not hard to keep them distinct, right? And of course, if there's lots of things they could show to try and demonstrate that I haven't kept them distinct. I mean, they could look at my pattern of grading and see that I give minority students lower grades. No, they won't find that. I mean, it's impossible. Lower grades than other professors do. I've asked them for that data. I've asked them for a forensics examination. Do I grade differently from other first-year professors? What are the patterns? And of course, they've accused me of speaking falsely about minority performance in my class and elsewhere, but if they refuse to produce the data, they can just make that accusation without proof. This is a law school. they're teaching their students that you can accuse someone of doing something without proving it. Okay, I guess that's whiteness to prove something, so they're getting rid of that with no explanation.
Do you miss teaching first-year students?
What?
Do you miss teaching
Do I
first-year
miss
students?
yeah, well, yes and no. I enjoyed my first-year classes, but I have talked to other first-year professors in the past couple of years, and they say it's no longer fun to teach first-year classes because you're always on your guard against committing some kind of violation or infraction of the progressive, woke, rule book, which changes constantly. So I've talked to professors, let's say, who teach criminal law. Teaching sexual assault is a minefield.
Sure.
They allow students to opt out of their lessons on sexual assault. That's crazy, but they do it because they're scared and they want to protect themselves. Students object whenever race comes up, police shootings, and you show them data that contradict the received wisdom, they get really angry. So it's, first year teaching is not what it used to be.
Let me go the other gamut from a kind of large, lecture class to sort of seminar, and one sort of centerpiece of Penn's report is your seminar on conservative thought and the
Yes.
sort of invitation of Jared Taylor. Is that something that you regret or don't regret, or how do you feel about sort of, we've covered, I think, sort of the world of opinion, teaching, but then kind of bringing someone into that academic space. How do you think through that?
Well, I don't know why I would regret it. The topic of the course is conservative political and legal thought, and it covers historical conservative thought, how it's influenced the law, and then it also covers contemporary right of center thought and what's going on, what people are thinking in the United States today. And, whether you like it or not, Jared Taylor is an educated, informed, articulate proponent of a certain, I guess you would call it, far-right position, just to be descriptive about it. And the students, well, here's the thing. The students know nothing about this stuff. All they know is that they are supposed to condemn it and call it evil. That's all they know. And you know what? My dean, who is one of the worst deans in America, I think, for sure, of a law school.
I was shocked at his comment, just to interrupt,
He
when he
doesn't
said that
know.
he was pissed off that you teach at the school. I mean,
Yeah, he said it sucks.
It sucks.
He was pissed off. He says this to students because he panders to students constantly. He grovels to students. It's embarrassing. But anyway, maybe I'm tipping him off because I do plan to ask him this. If I asked him today, what does Jared Taylor believe? What is his philosophy? What does American Renaissance, the organization that he started, what are their precepts and their beliefs? He could not tell you. He is proudly ignorant of the actual substance of what these groups stand for. And all they know is the Southern Poverty Law Center says they're white supremacist or white nationalist. Well, he couldn't define a white nationalist if his life depended on it. My students can't define it. They can't define white supremacy. They don't know what these terms mean. They have no idea, okay? Complete and total ignorance. I am a teacher. I am a professor. I am there to, banish that ignorance. Jared Taylor can come and inform them about what his organization is about. I tell them, you don't have to endorse a single thing he says. You don't have to agree with him on anything. You don't have to believe him. You don't have to do any of that stuff, but you do have to develop a better understanding of what is going on the conservative side in our country. And to object to that is inexplicable. It is, I've called it educational malpractice.
Let me ask you about another quote that appeared in that Times piece, and this was from also a person at FIRE, I'm sure you'll remember it. She said, academic freedom has to protect the Amy Waxes of the world so it can be there for the Galileos of the world. Is that how you
take issue with
is
that
that, are you a tax that academic freedom has to, and who are the Galileos of the world?
Right.
And how do you, I guess a way of saying kind of like, how do you see yourself? Are you a martyr? Are you kind of a frontline shock troop? Are you a test case? How do you think of yourself in this sort of broader ideological landscape?
Well, I mean, I was not that happy with that statement because this is an uncharitable interpretation of that statement, which was, I think, totally off the cuff, which implies that, Galileo's contribution was valuable, or it proved to be valuable and true. But Amy Wax, somehow isn't really making not just a contribution on that order, but any contribution. Well, I disagree with that adamantly. I am making a massive contribution. I am a very important person at the University of Pennsylvania, right? Why? Because students contact me regularly, and the administration doesn't know this because these students are very protective of their identity. They want to have coffee, they want to talk, they want to consult me. How do I deal with the culture war? How do I deal with my disagreement and dissent from the received wisdom? How do I deal with my woke harridan classmates who threaten to report me every minute? What do I do, and what do I do when I get out of school? And they tell me I am the only person at Penn that they feel safe talking to about this stuff, who they know won't turn them in for crime. Think I have a unique, important role. I would just call it a pastoral role, I guess, pastoral/intellectual role, counseling students who are not with the program. I also have a very important role as a teacher who brings up the full gamut of arguments, the narrative as well as the counter-narrative that is absent from other classes. Mm-hmm. And what I tell students, and this is true, I am willing to entertain and make arguments and give them data and readings and information that reflect the thinking of an enormous chunk of our public in our democracy. Mm-hmm. The stuff that is discussed in living rooms, in kitchens, behind closed doors, at dinner parties, right? We have 75 million people who voted for Trump. Think about that, okay? They effectively have no place in the university. We, in order to understand our society, our democracy, we have to canvass the full range of opinions. Students have to learn to deal with the full range of opinions and at least be familiar with them. They're not even familiar with them. They're not familiar with the basic data. I'll give you an example, right? I asked my students, once again, this is about race, but race is everywhere. What percentage of black children are born out of wedlock? And they're like orders of magnitude off, right? The latest figures that I've seen is 77%. They're shocked. They're amazed. Well, they've been studying inequality and race for years and years and years, right? Unless they're like a hard science major. They have no idea of what the data shows, right? They've never heard of any of the historical documents or events that have been concerned about black dysfunction, high crime rates, disintegrating families, education gaps. The Moynihan Report, they have no idea who Daniel Patrick Moynihan is.
Let me ask you,
that's sort of ignorance.
In terms of, thinking about group disparities and sort of how the left, the progressives are doing it in one sort of way and have developed their own language, in terms of your sense of how to do that in a way that's not racist, is it data driven? Like, is that, if you would say, Professor Wax, how do we talk about group disparities in a way that's both honest but also not toxic? Is that what you would say is sort of like numbers-based data? Because this historically has been a problem. How do you talk about this stuff, right? And sort of there's a kind of way in which there's a fear of, touching the third rail.
Sure.
And so if the rail is here, people want to be here, they don't want to be here, right? So do you think you've developed a way to talk about some of these thorny questions?
Well, first of all, I would banish the words toxic and racist, which I call them lefty terms, right? Those are the terms that have been imposed on us. The left gets to define them, and then, of course, they don't define them so that they can define them any old way they want on any given occasion to bludgeon you and bully you. So let's get rid of those words, right? So the question is, how do we develop the counter-narrative? I mean, I've sort of already addressed this, that we need a counter-narrative that is more based in empirics and realism. Charles Murray, who I admire greatly, just wrote a book called Facing Reality. And in that book, he lays out the data on, critical social facts that he thinks everybody needs to know and that policy needs to acknowledge and face up to when it comes to inequality and racial inequality and group inequality, which is a major preoccupation, right? And, he sets out data on differences in school achievement, skill, cognitive ability, the IQ gap, which has been there forever, and no study has really ever contradicted it. One standard deviation difference in cognitive ability between blacks and whites, and that's just this unfortunate fact, but it's a fact. Differences in criminality, a lot of data on that, right? Those are his two major preoccupations in the book. I would add a third, which is gaps, differences in family structure and family stability, and marriage rates, out-of-wedlock birth rates, really important for the developing of social capital. So there's lots of data out there. I mean, if they're trying to hide the data lately, that's their new technique. We're not going to publish the SATs. We're not going to publish scores. I mean, that's happening now, so that makes it more difficult. But there's data from not too long ago on all of those things. And they're important because they show why it is unrealistic to expect equal outcomes by race when you have those facts operating, right? Unless you create egregious double standards.
Let me take you back to campus for a second, and I know we're sort of towards the end of our time. I was interested in that, they're the professors who sort of have lined up against you. I was interested in a group of people, of professors themselves with tenure, who sort of denounce you in the most vituperative language, and then say, but I think she should keep tenure. What do you make of that group? Right? I mean, do you see those as your allies? Do you see those as kind of, what to make of those people? Are they just sort of kind of having it both ways?
Well, there is a pattern, yes. I can think of several people. I won't name them. People have actually mounted eloquent defenses of academic freedom, so I'm grateful for that. But they always feel like they have to preface it with this disclaimer, right? Well, I don't agree with her. That would be the mildest form, versus her views are reprehensible. They're toxic. They're awful.
Professor
really
in that article said you were a scholarly embarrassment.
I'm an embarrassment. They have to put me down, and of course it starts to sound like lefty talk of not only are you wrong, but you're evil. That's a central trope of wokeism, of course, that we divide the world into good people and evil people, and good people believe all the right things and the evil people believe the wrong things and they're racist and they're xenophobic. So they're kind of tying into that trope. Well, I mean, they're entitled to react to the substance of my statements as they do. I don't begrudge them that, I think some of them are just mouthing luxury beliefs, they're posturing, and the reason I say that is because they don't really have anything but the most superficial understanding of what I've said or written. They just go by what Vox, says I've said, or the New York Times, the little fragments that get lifted to make me look really bad. They never really read anything that I write or take it seriously. So a lot of it is just laziness and sloppy thinking. And then ultimately they're just trying to defend themselves against attack. Let me say one more thing about this. I think one of the things that's happened in academia and in the world at large is the distinction between defending your right to say something and agreeing with what you say. That distinction has become soft and kind of collapsed. And a lot of students are really incapable of seeing that distinction. Well, that is a fundamental distinction, the kind that the ACLU and our whole society has depended on. I don't necessarily agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. How many people now will embrace that? Even the ACLU has given up on that, right? So I think they are uncertain about whether they can hold the line on that central commitment of free thought and free speech. I mean, I was raised with that. I have no problem with it. I understand its importance. I sat at the dinner table when the Nazis marched through Skokie, Illinois, and my father said, I'm proud to live in a country where the Nazis can march through Skokie, Illinois, because he understood that the freedom to express abhorrent views or views you've adamantly disagreed with was essential.
Let me ask you, what do you think will happen to you? How do you think this plays out? I mean, my own alma mater at Stanford has been consumed by controversy, and in that case, the dean of the law school and the president did sort of apologize to Judge Duncan. But what struck me was not so much the apology, it was that next morning when the dean was on her way to go teach her constitutional law class, the entire whiteboard was plastered with posters and students were blocking and protesting. And I said, the next time something like this happens, I don't know if that line will be held,
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is, I don't know. I think their case against me is just pathetic. But if they want to work a revolution and turn the university into a bastion of wokeism, no dissent allowed, Penn is a private university. They have the wherewithal to do that. The powers that be, the faculty, senate, and frankly, the people on my committee that are going to conduct this supposed hearing, I don't consider them a jury of my peers. It's stacked with education professors and, no comment.
Right.
So the belief system of these people, I have a hint of it, and, it's untoward. On the other hand, I mean, so it may just ultimately be a show trial, kangaroo court. It's all about power, and they're gonna, get rid of me because they want to get rid of people like me, period, right? But the more optimistic part of me thinks, no, this is, they are going to see the price of doing this, and maybe some of them even have some principles. I don't know. So between those two poles, anything could happen, and my friends and advisors will take the gloomy view, versus some will take the more institutionally optimistic view, and everything in between. I mean, I would love to stay on. I'm going to fight the good fight. I am going to fight it to the death. You know, if there's any kind of adverse decision, I'm going to take it to court. I have deep pocket supporters. I have wonderful lawyers in Washington waiting to help me out. I am committed to staying the course because I'm in a good position to do it. You know, I'm 70 years old. I'm reaching the end of my career. I'm reasonably financially secure. I have a supportive family. I have many friends. I wouldn't choose to leave Penn. I'll be very disappointed and upset if I can't teach law anymore, because it's really important that I be there for my students. Many students have told me, when you're gone, it's over. You know, and that really, I take that very much to heart. But I would have to, you know, roll with it. I have to accept whatever comes. So I don't really have a choice.
Professor Amy Wax, thank you for joining New York Sun.
Thank you very much for having me.